Before we jump into today's video, I want to give a huge shout out to today's sponsor, Easy Roller Dice, with their stunning new Kickstarter, Heroic Dice of Metallic Luster, which is live right now. Metal dice are cool, no doubt, but metal dice of heroic luster are even better. These heroic dice are just incredibly stunning, and Easy Roller is offering every single variation that you guys see here available for backers on day one. None of these are behind stretch goals. And alongside these beautiful dice, Easy Roller is launching the new adventure boxes and dice coffers too to help you keep all of your dice safe, and they even included a few different places to keep your miniatures tucked away neatly. Down in the description of this video, you'll find a link that will take you straight to everything you need, and by using that link, it'll let Easy Roller know that I sent you over, which is really a great way to help out the channel. Thank you, Easy Roller, for being a part of the Taking 20 team. Last week, I talked about how to be a better healer for your Dungeons & Dragons 5e game, and if you haven't checked that one out, I would highly recommend it. It's a pretty good video, if I can toot my own horn for a moment, but that brings us to this week for the Striker role. Today, we're talking about a few different D&D tips to be a better damage dealer, Striker, DPS, although technically, that'd be more of a DPR, damage per round, in the tabletop world, but you guys get the idea. I've decided to break up this video into two parts to just make it easier to view, and we'll be releasing the second part to this video later this week, so keep an eye out for that. Hopefully, these D&D player tips will help you and your friends fight back terrifying dragons and fend off those foul fiends from the abyss. The first thing we should cover is, who are the strikers? Are you playing a striker for your party? Because unlike the healer, this role can be a little broader to define and includes a lot of different classes, because this role will include both melee and ranged variants. This party role includes classes like the Fighter, Rogue, Monk, Ranger, and even the Sorcerer and Warlock, but it can also include some Barbarians, some Paladins, and even some Bard classes like the Valor Bard or the Whispers Bard. It all comes down to play style and what you are trying to accomplish for your party. If your main job is to be good at killing things, you're probably taking on the role of a striker. As far as the striker's job, your job is not just to deal out damage, but to deal out that damage quick and efficiently. And of course, there will be other tasks, but we'll get to those shortly. What I want to re-emphasize is efficiently. Your job is not just to do a lot of damage, but to do that damage efficiently. So let's talk about some strategies and ways we can do that. The first strategy I want to talk about is easily one of the most important things you can master as your group's D&D striker, and that's positioning, positioning, positioning. Positioning is so incredibly important as a damage striker, even more so than the healer or the tank, because it's a lot like playing a point guard, right? You've got to be able to see and read the entire court, or in our case, the field of combat, to best position yourself to help you and your allies survive. For melee types, we want to first look for opportunities to create flanking bonuses, if our table, of course, has any flanking bonus rules that they use. While doing this, we want to prioritize helping any rogues in the party for that powerful sneak attack. If you happen to be playing a rogue that doesn't generate their own sneak attacks, here's a pro tip. While there is no true holding action anymore in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, you can still ready an action. When the trigger happens, you can perform the action with a reaction. For all other melee striker classes, using a readied action typically means losing extra attack. However, as the rogue, we don't have extra attack. So if combat is trudging along and you end up moving up to a new target before the fighter or the barbarian can join you and help generate that sneak attack, what we can do is simply move with our movement speed and ready an attack, with the trigger being, when Barnabas attacks the troll, all attack it from behind. Sadly, this does mean that we would no longer be able to attack with, say, an offhand dagger, specifically because of how two-weapon fighting is worded in the PHB, but say 46 from triggering a sneak attack successfully is still the much better play than the D4 from a dagger would be. Line of sight. When we're moving around the battlefield, we need to be aware of incoming ranged attack. First off, we don't want to be unnecessarily blocking our own allies while they try to fire in range spell attacks and crossbow bolts. Second off, if we can put our foes at a disadvantage when firing at us, we want to try to do that. Remember, the cover rules can be found on page 196 in the combat chapter of the player's handbook, and specifically mention that half cover can be generated by a creature, whether that creature is a friend or an enemy. We want to look for those chances to create opportunity attacks if we can. Remember, ranged characters get disadvantage on ranged attacks while melee combatants are within 5 feet of him. That's going to force them into melee combat, which they may or may not be as good at, especially if they are a caster throwing firebolts, or they will need to move away, generating a free attack for you and increasing your overall damage output. Another thing we want to keep an eye out for is double doorways and 10-foot hallways. We want to use these as choke points when it makes sense and avoid bogging down combat when it doesn't. If, for example, you're going to clog up the hallway with your party's tank next to you, you want to make sure you are reducing more incoming attacks than outgoing from behind you. So if the party is vastly outnumbered, great idea. If the party is more on an even footing, it may be better to move past the opponents if possible to open up those ranged assaults from the casters and archers in the back. If we're playing ranged strikers, we want to make sure that we are staying far enough away from potential melee enemies that might charge into us and multi-attack. So often this will mean 40 or 50 foot increments if possible at the beginning of a combat. And as combat wears on, if we are in charge of rushing to the rescue of a healer with a healing potion, if that's our job, then we want to move up so that we can do that, even if that does mean later in combat, inevitably moving closer to those enemies. And finally, on positioning, let's talk about trading places. This is where we'll separate the good strikers from the top tier strikers. If you want to be the best striker for your party you can be, we need to revisit that concept I mentioned earlier about being a floor general, or in our case, a battlefield general. It's your job to monitor where the highest pressure is being applied to your party when thinking about positioning. Our primary job as the striker is to deal as high of amount of damage as efficiently as we possibly can, but our secondary job is to back up our teammates, even if that means backing off the gas a bit for raw damage output. The tank is busy tanking. The healer is busy healing. Support and strikers are the ones with the flexibility to move around the field, and we need to use that to our advantage. We do this by letting the tank and the healer heal, but then stepping in to substitute if needed to draw pressure off those other party members, and that might even include another striker or even a support player. If we're a melee striker, we will be watching first for the tank, first and foremost, then the healer, then the other party members. If we're playing ranged strikers, we're really watching for the healer first, then the other party members, and then finally, then the tank. So let's say we're playing a sorcerer with the striker role. Typically, we'd like to position ourselves behind the healer because there's really no reason to be as close to our enemies as, say, the cleric needs to be. The cleric needs to reach all of the party members, and we don't. We are focused on not picking up disadvantage on our next firebolt because we got too close and let an enemy close ranks on us. But if an enemy slips past the front line to challenge the healer, what do we do now? The answer is nothing. We continue to deal out as much damage as we possibly can. When and if the healer starts taking a chunk of damage, or they are being pressured by 2 or more enemies, now we need to take control of the situation and move up to allow the healer to trade places with us and retreat. What this does is help the party maintain its maximum efficiency. If the healer had 60 hit points as a cleric and we have 50 as our sorcerer as the striker, what we need to do is realize that together we have 110 hit points. So long as neither of us reaches 0 in our individual hit point pools, we will continue to have 2 actions, 2 movements, 2 potential bonus actions, and 2 potential reactions every turn. The moment one of those 2 party members drops, the party's damage output capabilities are immediately and significantly diminished, whether it's the healer or the striker. So by moving up to share the load, we're able to use a bend but don't break strategy that stretches the damage output of whatever the dungeon master has thrown at us. It might seem weird to try and go up and take damage, but if that is allowing a near-death tank or a healer or a fellow party member to continue standing when they otherwise would have dropped, then that's the correct play. Just because we're the sorcerer or warlock standing safely in the back and we can continue to avoid damage doesn't mean we should always try to do that, particularly with how easy it is to heal in between adventuring days in 5e. Mastering the strategy of swapping places is what will help us do our job better and help us become true masters of this party role. All right, boys and girls, the next strategy I want to talk about is managing self-healing abilities. A lot of classes have little things that you can do to heal yourself during combat. Fighters have Second Wind, as an example. Paladins, of course, have Lay on Hands, and Valor Bards might even have access to traditional healing spells like Cure Wounds. But the question is, when do we need to use these things as strikers? Because there are clear times when using them would be the best option, and even others when it would be considered really bad timing to do so. Obviously, first and foremost, if we have abilities that can be used on others, we want at minimum to save one spell slot or some of the resources for those other party members in case of an emergency. But sometimes, particularly if the healer is having to focus on other party members like the tank, it's just going to be necessary to heal ourselves. In these cases, the golden rule is as big as you can, as late as you can. What that means is to give yourself the biggest heal you can at one time, preferably more than 2 incoming attacks from an enemy, and we want to delay having to use it as long as we can in the combat, so we can hopefully get through an enemy or 2 and reduce those incoming attacks before having to use it. If we can wait to heal ourselves while there is 4 incoming attacks by 2 enemies targeting us until we drop 1 and thus reduce those attacks to 2, that's the most efficient use of our healing. However, in certain circumstances where we can heal ourselves as a bonus action with, say, a fighter's Second Wind, it behooves us to use this as early as possible in the fight, as long as it won't overheal and waste those regained hit points. That also comes with the caveat of using those bonus action heals as early as possible in the last fight of the day. Obviously, you won't always know for sure if the party will have another encounter before a rest, but we can take an educated guess. And of course, I know that technically the fighter regains Second Wind after a short rest, but the point I'm trying to make here still remains. And finally, the last strategy here in part 1 is going to stay on the topic of action economy, and that's to talk about burst damage versus reserving resources. Basically, to answer the question, to smite or not to smite. As the striker, one thing we cannot do is get in the habit of hoarding resources at the cost of additional party healing. What does that mean? It means we can't be so timid and reserved in using our abilities that our party ends up taking in more damage than might otherwise have been necessary, and thus ends up overtaxing the party's healing, whether that's just the healer spell slots or healing potions or second winds, or even forcing the party to stop and rest more often. It's no good to stop and rest again in an hour into an adventuring day because the party is so low on hit points and you still have your unused action surge or several uses remaining of Hunter's Mark. What we want to do instead is to use those superiority dice, those smites and those key points early in combats to burst down enemies in order to dominate those combats. And it's far more efficient to using Hunter's Mark on the first round of a combat than it is to let enemies stick around and then decide to pop it on round 3. It's better to smite an enemy in round 1 if that ultimately helps take it off the board with your allies' help and eliminate an entire round of attacks and legendary actions than it is to use those abilities to finish them off later. If an attack with Psychic Blades would do 15 damage versus an attack without it for 7, it's more effective to get that full 15 points of damage in while the enemy is at 50 max hit points at the start of combat than it would be in round 4 when the enemy might be at just 2 or 3 hit points remaining. Now, does that mean we just want to burn through all of our abilities right away? No, of course not. But it does mean that it is mathematically more advantageous to be aggressive and decisive with using those additional damaging abilities earlier than it is later. And by understanding that and where our party might be in an adventuring day or how many more fights the DM may throw at us before we bail on the dungeon or face the boss, we can gain an edge so that we now go into those future fights with more hit points and healing than we would by letting the previous combats linger on unnecessarily. Later this week, we'll dig into the rest of the strategies for the striker, so be sure to look out for that video for more tips as we'll be discussing target prioritization, advanced action economy, and more. But for now, I want to pass it over to you guys in the community. What tips do you have for people that are playing the striker role, the damage dealer, the DPS, the DPR, whatever you want to call it? Do you guys have any additional tips for positioning that I didn't cover? And resources? How do you guys balance your resource? Do you find yourselves running out of things late in an adventuring day, or are you getting through the majority of your combats with still some things left over? I would love to know what your general experience is at your table currently. I, of course, want to give a massive thank you to all of the incredible patrons over at welcomeadventures.com. If you guys like what I do here, you want to support more content like this, welcomeadventures.com is a great way to support the channel and to snag some rewards for yourself. And so for that, yeah, go check it out. Do those things. If this is your first time here and you love role-playing games as much as I do, or maybe you're learning to love role-playing games as much as I do, I'd love to have you subscribe. I put out videos on GM tips, player tips, tutorials, and more stuff just like this. So if that sounds like something that you might be interested in, just hit that subscribe button down below and come join us. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Cody, and may your games be filled with awesome memories and even better friends. I'll catch you guys next time.
Yeah.